Religion is the subject of today's lecture. And let me say straight off that nothing is more challenging than trying to think yourself inside the head of a worshipper who belongs to a belief system that is different from your own. But the Egyptians win first prize for presenting us with an almost insurmountable challenge. My suspicion is that the average Egyptian probably found his religious system almost as big a challenge as we do, since it was an extremely secretive system. The priests seem to have gone out of their way to conceal it as much as possible. Perhaps it was a way of protecting and enhancing their importance, or perhaps they wished to keep the gods completely unsullied by you, the smelly hoi polloi, or probably a bit of both. The worship of many of the Egyptian gods began in the pre-dynastic period, the period before the kings. As in our other lectures, however, we're going to be focusing on the New Kingdom, the period from 1570 to 1070, which was when the Egyptians first began to build impressive temples to their gods. Previously, funerary chapels and the like had been far more impressive structures than temples to the gods. But now the gods moved to center stage. And it was also in this period that a professional priesthood first evolved. What we can say without qualification is that the Egyptians were intensely religious in the sense that most of them believed wholeheartedly in the gods. That's demonstrated by the fact that they expended so much money, as many as proportionately any other nation in history, on both their gods and on their dead. The subject of all their sculpture was either images of the gods or images of the dead, which was also true, by the way, of Greek sculpture. Unless you happened to be the pharaoh or in the pharaoh's immediate circle, you couldn't commission a portrait statue for display either in public or in the home. What you could do, however, was to commission a portrait statue for your tomb in the belief that it would guarantee your immortality. And likewise, the only buildings that the Egyptians constructed out of stone were either tombs, including, of course, the pyramids, and from the New Kingdom onwards, temples, along with all the other structures connected to temples. Private dwellings, including palaces, were typically made of mud brick. Egyptian religion was supported by a vast bureaucratic and economic substructure. It's been estimated that by the end of the New Kingdom, approximately 1/5 of the entire population was working in the service of religion, and that 1/3 of the land was owned by the gods. Like the Mesopotamians and like other polytheistic peoples, you held to a system of belief that allotted each god or goddess, among many, a limited amount of power. What distinguished your deities from those of Mesopotamia, however, was that many of them were hybrids. They were half human and half animal, or at least that is how they were frequently depicted in art, with human bodies and animal heads. There's the falcon god Horus, god of the sky and protector of the pharaoh, who is depicted either as a falcon or as a man with the head of a falcon. Then there's Hathor, the goddess of motherhood, who is depicted either as a cow or as a woman wearing a crown consisting of a pair of cow's horns surrounding the sun. There's the jackal-headed god Anubis, patron of embalmers, the ibis-headed god Thoth, the scribe of the gods and the inventor of writing, and so on. The intriguing question is this: Did the Egyptians actually think of their gods in this form, as half animal or half human, or did they think of them in a more abstract way, combining the qualities of both animals and humans? One theory is that the prehistoric Egyptians did indeed worship animals, cats, cows, jackals, crocodiles, etc., because of their special powers. Cats, for instance, dispose of rats and rodents and therefore would have been highly valued and esteemed. Perhaps as early as 3000 BC, however, the Egyptians had come to think of their gods not only in animal form, but also in human form. In other words, they anthropomorphized them. Incidentally, the same theory has been applied to the Greeks. The goddess Athena, for instance, was closely associated with the owl, the god Zeus, with the eagle, and so on. But whereas the Greeks almost wholly dispensed with the belief that their gods had animal forms as well, the Egyptians never did. Why? The most likely explanation is that they were a highly conservative people who retained the old ideas even when they introduced the new ones. Not all the Egyptian gods have their origins in animal worship, however, and one of the most important gods was Ptah, the chief god at Memphis, who was credited with creating the world by simply imagining it in his mind and then giving it palpable form by giving utterance to his thought. The Egyptians believed that words had magical powers. It's rather like the creation story in Genesis. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Though a significant deity, Ptah never achieved national, quote-unquote, importance, unlike Amun-Re. The name Amun means the hidden one. He was called the hidden one because his form was unknown, though for the sake of convention, he was represented as a man with an ostrich plume crown. He became Amun-Re by acquiring the power of the sun god Re or Ra. Amun-Re rose to unrivaled dominance in the New Kingdom due to the fact that Thebes, which was the home of his principal sanctuary, now became the capital of Egypt. And that event reflects the rise to power of his priesthood at this time. A distinctive feature of the Egyptian gods, one that distinguishes them sharply from the Greek gods, is that they didn't have the same highly specific powers. Whereas the Greek god Poseidon, say, was the god of the sea and of earthquakes, Amun's powers were indefinable. Another national deity was Osiris, the protector of the dead, who was depicted as a mummiform figure, and Aten, who was shown as a sun disk. Incidentally, the Nile wasn't worshipped as a god. He was a lesser, semi-divine being, appropriately depicted as a fat man holding a tray laden with food. All the gods had myths attached to them, and as an Egyptian, you would have been familiar with many of these myths. There was no official version of any myth, however, and the versions that circulated tended to vary greatly from place to place and time to time, all adding to the confusion. It's a characteristic of myths that they are open to varied interpretation and manipulation for political purposes, to promote this or that deity and therefore this or that priesthood. Egyptian religion was inseparable from Egyptian politics. So, for instance, there were 3 different Egyptian creation myths associated with 3 different cities, all competing for power, though the version that came to prevail was that the world emerged from a kind of watery chaos. Probably the most important myth involved the struggle between Horus and Seth, between good and evil in a way. And we'll talk about that in the next lecture. As an ordinary Egyptian, however, you left the worship of the gods, other than domestic deities, entirely in the hands of the priesthood, whose principal task it was to perform services on their behalf every day. You yourself weren't even permitted to enter a temple ever. Now that's because the temple was the dwelling of the god and had to be kept completely pure. If you'd entered it, you would have polluted it. You were, however, permitted to pass through the monumental gateway that gave access to the temple complex and stand in the forecourt. The monumental gateway consisted of two tapering towers known as pylons erected on either side of the entrance. You enter the forecourt, which has colonnades along two sides with an altar for performing sacrifices in the middle. And it's here, if at all, that you would experience the numinous presence of the deity. Beyond the forecourt lay a covered hall, and beyond the covered hall lay the temple itself. If you were a person of some rank, you might deposit a valuable votive offering in the forecourt. A votive offering is an offering made in fulfillment of a vow. In making your offering, you would pray to the god or goddess as follows: if you restore my wife to health, then I will give you such and such a gift. Or alternatively, you might make a votive offering in expectation that the deity will answer your request. There were also places on the outer walls of the temple complex which are described as chapels of the hearing ear, where you could whisper your prayer into a sculptural representation of a pair of ears. As well, there were lots of small local shrines devoted to specific gods dotted throughout Egypt, where you could leave your own votive offering or make a sacrifice. So, as an ordinary person, you weren't completely cut off from the major state gods. However, the only occasion when you, as an ordinary Egyptian, would see the cult statues of the deities that were housed inside the temples was at festival times, when they left their homes and were borne in procession. If you were lucky, you might even get to ask one of the gods a question as he or she resided temporarily in a wayside shrine on his or her journey. The deity would give a simple yes or no answer to whatever your question was. Many of the festivals coincided with important junctures in the agricultural calendar, such as the beginning and end of the inundation season, that's to say in June and September respectively. But what would you have made of a festival? You would no doubt have been greatly impressed by the splendor of the pageantry. You would also have believed that the cult statue was in a real sense the deity himself or herself. But I doubt that you would have understood much more than that. It was not the business of the priesthood to explicate what they did on behalf of the gods or to enlighten you about the nature of the gods. They had much more important things to be doing. So for the most part, at festival time, you would probably have gulped. It would have been a day off work, that's always nice, but hardly an occasion to express your piety. In fact, it's difficult to understand what piety might have meant in an Egyptian context. Festivals were opportunities for jollity and, to some extent, frivolity. There would have been a lot of free food and free booze going around, and All of this would have been accompanied by much singing and dancing. If you lived long enough, you might get to attend the Sed festival, which was held at Memphis. That celebrated the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. In other words, the creation of Egypt as a single nation. The Sed festival was normally held after the pharaoh had reigned for 30 years, and it was then repeated at 3-year intervals after that. Many of the major gods were invited to pay their respects to the pharaoh on this occasion. That's to say, their statues were removed from their temples and brought by boat down the Nile to Memphis. Unfortunately, we know very little about the details of the festival. What we do know is that it culminated in the pharaoh running a circuit to prove that he was still virile and athletic. He did so clutching a vase, an oar, and a carpenter's square, and alternately wearing the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. No doubt you would have cheered him for all you were worth as you stood there watching the old boy panting as he trotted past. No doubt your heart was in your mouth when you saw him trip. Probably priests accompanied him on either side, ready to prop the old fellow up if he should stumble. Even so, it would have been a pretty bad omen if he couldn't complete the circuit unaided. There's even a theory that the Sed festival was originally instituted to replace the ritual murder of a pharaoh who was deemed no longer capable of performing his job. It's always possible, of course, that you might choose to become a priest yourself, though in order to qualify, you'd have to be educated in order to read and write hieroglyphics. The hope is, too, that your parents would have chosen this career for you at birth because you had to be circumcised. And probably the priesthood mostly ran in families. We don't know why circumcision was performed for priests. It may have represented a covenant to the gods, similar to the covenant that is established between Abraham and the Lord in Genesis through circumcision. The Egyptian priesthood was very hierarchical. At the top was the pharaoh. The pharaoh was the son of Ra and a god in his own right, and when he died, he went to join the other gods. Members of the upper class had to kneel and bow their heads to the floor in his presence, whereas the hoi polloi had to prostrate themselves. Directly under him was an official called the overseer of the temples and prophets of all the gods. The overseer had to administer the enormous wealth that the gods possessed, deriving partly from their estates and partly from taxation. Below the overseer came the high priests, one for each of the gods who were worshipped throughout Egypt. And below the high priests were the chief priests, one for each temple. It was the task of the chief priests to supervise the lesser priestly officials, of whom the most important were the Wab priests. So let's imagine you've finished your training and you've become a Wab priest yourself. It's your primary duty to attend to the cult statue of the god or goddess whom you served. Each morning, you break open the clay seals of the doors of the shrine in which the cult statue was housed, and then you solemnly remove the statue from the shrine. No cult statue has survived, but we do have a description of the statue of Amun from an inscription dating to the time of the boy pharaoh Tutankhamun. We're told it was covered in electrum, lapis lazuli, turquoise, and, quote, every precious stone. The core of the statue would have been wooden. And while you were removing it, you intoned prayers, sang hymns, swung censers, and made obeisance. You then solemnly removed the garments that the statue was wearing. Next, you bathed it, you purified it, and you provided it with fresh clothing and jewelry. And after that, you placed it back in its shrine and laid out a ritual meal consisting of food and drink on an offering table, which you then presented to it in symbolic form. After a decent lapse of time, while the cult statue digested, you removed the offering, and when you were done, you sealed the doors again and purified the whole sanctum, brushing away all traces of your footprints as you backed towards the exit. You did all this to protect the deity from forces of disorder and chaos. And you performed this same ritual 3 times a day, and the next day you did it all again 3 times. It seems rather boring to us, but we must remember that Egypt's security depended on it. So I suspect you were required to be on your toes in case anything went amiss. So do your best. There were also other lesser priests, including the scroll carriers who read and looked after the sacred texts that were housed in each temple, and the horologers or prophets who observed the heavens in order to determine the exact timing of daily rites, and who also kept track of the festival calendar. As a priest, you would reside inside the temple complex along with the rest of the temple staff, that's to say, people who looked after the buildings, cooked your meals, and so forth. The temple complex also included a school, which is where you trained to become a priest. As we've noted, being a Wab priest was rather repetitive. The good news is that you would typically work for 1 month and then have 3 months off, like all Egyptian priests. And during your month on, you had to remain ritually clean by bathing frequently. You had to shave your head, wear a long white linen kilt, and refrain from sexual intercourse. During your 3 months off, however, you were not bound in any way by your priestly functions. You could wear what you liked, do what you liked, and there's nothing to suggest that you had to be what we might call being spiritual or devout. So far, we've talked exclusively about official religion. I now want to turn to private religion. Most of what we know about private religion has to do with death, which I'm leaving till the next lecture. Mainly what you do is pray to the domestic deities whenever you have need of their assistance. One of the most frequently invoked domestic deities was Bes, a grinning male dwarf with the facial features, feet and tail of a lion and a bloated stomach. Bes guarded your home in part by warding off snakes, always a danger in Egypt. Women also invoked Bes when they were giving birth. We find his image depicted on headrests, beds, mirror handles, other domestic objects, and on amulets that have been carved from hippopotamus ivory. Another domestic deity was Taweret. Taweret was depicted as a pregnant hippopotamus standing upright on lion's feet and carrying a crocodile on her back. She too protected women in labor. You might too occasionally pray to one of the major gods. We have a prayer that was written by a workman called Neferabu, who lived in Deir el-Medina, in which he confesses that he has sworn falsely by the god Ptah, who has now blinded him as a punishment, and he humbly asks for Ptah's mercy and forgiveness. Religion was a stabilizing force in Egyptian society. Only once was there an attempt made to shift its course dramatically. The attempt was made by the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who reigned from 1350 to 1334 BC. Amenhotep took the bold and revolutionary step of seeking to replace polytheism with monotheism, or at least something close to monotheism. He abolished the worship of the traditional gods and promulgated the sun disk, the Aten, and changed his name to Akhenaten, which means beneficial to the Aten. And when I say he abolished them, what I mean is that he sent his agents up and down the land, armed with their chisels, to expunge the names of all the traditional gods from all the temples and other monuments that bore their names. The experiment to replace the traditional gods was deeply resented both by the priesthood, who saw their livelihoods put at risk. Imagine, too, being an ordinary Egyptian. Everything that everyone has believed in for 1,500 years is now denounced. Overnight, you have to change your whole way of seeing the world. How would you feel? I bet you'd be deeply concerned for your country's safety. The gods will be angry. There's a very good chance that the world will come to an end. Unfortunately, we know very little about what steps Akhenaten took to educate the ordinary Egyptian people into this new belief. Indeed, we don't actually know whether he took any steps at all. He may simply have handed down a directive forbidding the worship of the traditional gods and the closing of their temples. Whatever the facts, it's more appropriate to think of Akhenaten's bold venture as an experiment in henotheism, the elevation of one deity above all others, rather than as monotheism tout court, with a single transcendental Godhead. Our best insight into the challenge that any people faces in making the switch from polytheism to monotheism is provided by the book of Exodus, which describes the first fumbling attempts by the Hebrews to abandon polytheism in favor of monotheism. "Thou shalt worship no other gods before me," says the first commandment, implying that there are other gods around whom other peoples worship. And very likely you have been worshipping them yourself. Henceforth, however, you're only permitted to worship the one God, Yahweh. In the course of their exodus, after their escape from Egypt, we see the Hebrews constantly complaining and even reverting to polytheism by worshipping a golden calf. Akhenaten, as I said, was way ahead of his time. And when he died, Egypt returned to its old ways. No doubt, the traditional priesthood breathed a collective sigh of relief. In conclusion, Egyptian religion seems to have placed remarkably few demands upon the common man and woman. The Hebrew God, as we learn from the Jewish Bible, was a jealous God who struck terror and guilt into the entire race. The Egyptians, by contrast, were spared both terror and guilt. You didn't have to worry about placating angry gods. That was handled by experts. That was why you paid your taxes, to leave the difficult and mysterious business of handling the gods to those best qualified. And if things did go wrong, you could always blame the priests or the pharaoh. If you experienced a domestic difficulty or anxiety, you could invoke Bes or Taweret, but for that, you didn't need any expertise. All you had to do as far as the state gods were concerned was to turn up at the festivals, and that meant having a good time, drinking, dancing, and merrymaking. You didn't need to seek spiritual guidance or to conduct yourself in accordance with a moral code that was sanctioned by religion. So, Just get on with your daily life, secure in the knowledge that the Nile will flood, your crops will sprout up, your wife will give birth to a healthy child. Egypt will stand firm against its enemies, and all will continue as before in its time-hallowed way. In the next lecture, we're going to look at the other aspect of Egyptian religion, which did require very considerable input from ordinary Egyptians, namely death and the dead. We'll see how they sought to prolong the pleasures of human existence into the afterlife. And we'll also see that so much of what has been handed down through the centuries has its roots in Egyptian belief.